All right, well, hi everybody, and welcome to the next installment of NTA's live event. My name is Tom Fabian, and I'm a functional nutritionist and also an educator. And my functional nutrition practice is mostly focused on, healthy aging and also the microbiome and gut health. And that area is really what I specialize in, and especially the connections between the microbiome and the digestive system, the immune system, the nervous system, and the metabolic system as well. There's lots of connections there. And so what I really focus on in addition to my practice is also educating practitioners on all the information that's coming out about the microbiome. So as you know, it's really an important area. It's getting a lot of attention. There's a lot of new research in the area of the microbiome. So I have a scientific background, and I spent a number of years in research. And so I spend a lot of time really translating that research into information that's available to practitioners through my website, Microbiome Mastery. And so on that site, there's a number of different courses available for practitioners to learn about the microbiome. So before I dive in, I just want to talk a little bit about what I want to do today with this particular opportunity. So I wanted to kind of split it into two parts. So I want to aim for about an hour. In the first 30 minutes or so, I'd like to focus on, as you may have seen in the description, the myths and misconceptions about the microbiome. And a lot of those have to do with understanding around probiotics, so I'll be addressing that to some extent. And then also focusing on the microbiome in the larger picture. So I'll do that for about the first half hour, and then the second half hour will be focused on going through some of the best practices, the best ways to help balance the microbiome, and really talk about what that means to balance the microbiome. So that's going to be kind of the focus, and I'm definitely going to be answering questions throughout. So the goal is to not just be totally informational here, but also answer questions as they come up related to what I'm talking about. So go ahead and make sure when I'm covering these different topics, if you happen to have a question about it, feel free to go ahead and post that question, and I'll go through as many questions as I can. And then at the end, once the roughly an hour is up, covering the two different topics, then I will help answer some of the questions that people still have at that point. So let me just double check to make sure I'm following along on the laptop so I can follow the questions at the same time. So I just want to make sure that I can see that. So hold on just a moment. All right, so let me go ahead and get started. So as far as the key misconceptions and sort of misunderstandings about the microbiome, again, a lot of them have to do with probiotics. There's a lot of interest in probiotics as a therapeutic tool. So I want to start there and really focus on that as kind of a key piece. So in terms of probiotics, one of the things that I think is probably the most common, it's not really a misunderstanding, but I think it's a bit of a perception in terms of the importance of probiotics versus other approaches to the microbiome. So when I talk to practitioners or when they ask me questions about the microbiome and sort of what to do in practice, most of the questions have to do with probiotics. And so there seems to be this perception that when you're working with the microbiome, that the prime way or one of the primary ways of working with the microbiome is by probiotics. And so it certainly is one of the important tools that we have to work with. But I want to kind of put that in perspective in terms of the larger picture of tools that we also have to work with. So in terms of probiotics and being the most effective therapy, really there's a wide range of approaches that we have at our disposal. And I would say actually that diet probably has a bigger impact than probiotics. And I'll be talking about that, particularly in the second half hour, talking about best ways to balance the microbiome. So that's really kind of the bigger picture I wanted to talk about in terms of probiotics, is that we have this wider range of factors. We really should be taking into account all these different factors when we're considering how to work with the microbiome. So I mentioned diet, certainly probiotics. There's also prebiotics, and then an area I think that isn't really emphasized that much yet, which is certainly an area that I'm focusing a lot more on and emphasizing when I present about the microbiome, is the area of phytonutrients. And so those have a really big impact also on the microbiome, and I think that they have a lot of potential, in particular some untapped potential, to help us sort of shape and shift the microbiome in directions that are potentially more balanced and more healthy. So really, again, it's about kind of seeing probiotics in that bigger perspective and not seeing probiotics as sort of the main way. It's really one of the important tools, but not the main way to work with microbiome. So then the second misconception that I'd like to talk about has to do with the concept that I hear a lot, especially when practitioners are talking about using gut protocols, such as the 4R, 5R program, where practitioners are using terms like reseeding the microbiome, repopulating the microbiome, replenishing, reinoculating, words like that, suggests that probiotics are actually largely taking up residence in the microbiome and helping to kind of complement a depleted microbiome. And that's largely incorrect. And there's sort of several different things I want to talk about related to that in terms of, probiotics certainly have certain ways that they do help the microbiome and our health, but it's largely not by sort of reseeding or repopulating the microbiome. So when you think about kind of the numbers, so as you're going through the digestive tract, it's important to keep in mind that as you go further down the digestive tract, the concentration of the microbiome goes up quite a bit. So if you're starting with the stomach, the concentration there is usually around, plus or minus, it's around sort of 1,000 bacterial cells per mil. And we're talking primarily about bacteria here. So again, it's about 1,000 cells per milliliter of digestive fluid in the stomach. So a lot of people think the stomach is sterile because of stomach acid, but actually there are many types of bacteria, such as some lactic acid bacteria, that are resistant or relatively resistant to acid. So they are able to survive and thrive to some extent in the stomach, but for the most part it's a pretty hostile environment for bacteria. So again, around 1,000 per mil, and then that increases as you move along the small intestine until you reach the ileum, where the concentration really starts to go up. And in the ileum, the concentration is roughly in the range of about 10 million per mil, so quite a bit higher than in the stomach. But then when you get into the colon, where conditions are really quite a bit different, primarily that the transit time or the flow rate is much slower, so that allows the population to increase exponentially. And so we're talking about numbers in the range of like 100 billion or so per mil. So when you think about the concentration of probiotics, you might be taking something that's something like 1 billion or 30 billion CFUs. And so, that's overall a relatively small percentage by the time you get to the colon. And of course, only a certain percentage of those may survive the transit. So in terms of the entire colon, the estimates are that there's about 100 million or 100 trillion or so, 10 to 100 trillion bacteria total in the colon. So really this is just a small fraction, a small percentage. And so that's one of the things I wanted to kind of emphasize, is that actually when we're talking about different aspects or different areas along the digestive tract, that they're actually potentially going to have a bigger impact in the upper GI tract, because relative to the concentration that's normally there, the probiotic can be actually quite a bit higher, or at least a significant portion of that. So just something to keep in mind, that we shouldn't be thinking about the gut, of course, as one sort of unit, that the effect of probiotics is really going to vary depending on where we're talking about in the microbiome or in the digestive tract. All right, let me just see if there's any questions here real quick. Hold on just a moment. Okay, so I don't see any questions yet, so let me go ahead and move on. So the next kind of topic under probiotics that I want to talk a little bit about is the concept, it's related to what I just mentioned, but it's the concept of probiotics versus commensals. So there's a lot of confusion around the terms and how they're used. So again, probiotics are really meant to refer to supplements that are taken in one form or another that have a therapeutic benefit. So they're coming from the outside, essentially. So they're supplements. So they're considered, the general term is transient. So they're transient microbes, and for the most part, they don't take up residence in the microbiome. So that's something I think is not really widely known, again, because we hear this terminology like reseeding and repopulating. And a lot of studies have been done to take a look at this. And some review studies that sort of looked at all the published studies that are out there addressing how probiotics may or may not populate the digestive tract has pretty much concluded that for the most part they don't. They tend to stick around for a while, and that's going to vary a lot from person to person. And actually one study addressed that, that I came across, addressed that variability between individuals, where they took one particular probiotic strain. It was a strain of Fado Bacteria, and I don't remember how long the subjects actually took that probiotic, but they took it probably for like a month or so, and then they followed, tracked basically how long that lasted in their system by assessing the detection of that particular strain in stool samples. And they found a lot of variability where I think it was by about a 6-month time point, for 70% of those participants in the study, they had no more detectable levels after that treatment period, and about 30% actually still had detectable levels. So for the most part, they don't stick around, but it's going to be very individual. And in some individuals, those particular strains may be able to hang on a bit longer. So just something to keep in mind, and we'll get into this a bit more when I talk about the bigger picture about probiotics and the microbiome, but that's really something to keep in mind. Another aspect is some of the common groups of bacteria that are typically used in probiotics, like Lactobacilli. Of course, that's one of the most common in probiotics. There are a few that have been identified, a few species of Lactobacilli that actually are commensals normally. So commensals means normal residents of the microbiome. So they're basically there pretty much all the time, and they typically sort of, it varies between individuals, but on average, the total percentage of lactobacilli versus the whole microbiome is about 1%. So again, doesn't necessarily have a huge impact on the microbiome, at least in terms of numbers. Now, these are considered beneficial, and they do have beneficial effects. So let me talk about the next point then, which is related to their mechanisms. So if they're not populating the microbiome so much, how are they benefiting us? Because we know there's lots of studies that show that probiotics do benefit individuals in terms of various health conditions. So how do they do that? And it's really an active area of study, and we don't have all the answers yet. But some of the clues have to do with really 3 key points. One is that they can have some indirect effects on the other residents of the microbiome. And they can do that in various ways. They can produce factors, for example, that counteract some of the harmful bacteria and other microbes. And they can produce factors that actually, through their metabolism, they can produce factors that then feed some of the beneficial bacteria, and that's called cross-feeding. So that's one way that they can affect the microbiome and kind of help balance the microbiome, is again by counteracting some of the harmful ones and promoting some of the beneficial ones. And they also have a big impact on the intestinal lining, the epithelial layer, as well as the immune system. And lots of studies have showed that for the most part they do have beneficial effects on the lining as well as in balancing the immune system. Now, one thing to note is that's going to vary a lot from strain to strain. So not all strains have all these effects, and some strains tend to be more effective than others. Just to mention 2 that seem to be particularly effective and have a lot of research behind them in terms of helping to improve the barrier, the mucosal barrier, are Lactobacilli, or Lactobacillus rhamnosus, particularly strain GG. That's in a product I think called Culturelle. And then there's Lactobacillus reuteri also, which has been shown to improve intestinal barrier function. But many other different strains and species of lactobacilli and probiotics also can do that. So that's something I really wanted to focus on, is kind of clarify a little bit of the misunderstandings around probiotics. All right, so let me check again and see if there's any questions now about probiotics. All right, so I don't see any questions yet about probiotics. Okay, so I'll move on to the next one. So another question that's typically asked around probiotics, and there's a lot of emphasis on this in terms of probiotics and whether or not they need to be kept refrigerated and things like that in order to improve viability, is do probiotics need to be alive to have their effects? So, and again, a number of studies have been done to address this. And for the most part, it's actually a little bit more complicated than just sort of black and white. So it turns out that some of the components, especially like cell wall components of the bacteria, actually do have effects, even when there's no live bacteria. So when they've been killed or destroyed, then these cell wall components can still have effects. So part of the answer is yes, they can still have an effect, but some of the positive effects that they have, such as cross-feeding the beneficial bacteria, counteracting some of the harmful bacteria, etc., have to do with metabolic functions that require them to be alive. So that's basically kind of in a nutshell what I would say about that is that it's really kind of in between, that you can get a few effects from the probiotics when they're not alive, but you get more effects for the most part. Okay, I see a couple of questions coming in through here. Let's see. What do you think of soil-based probiotics? So soil-based probiotics, actually that was one of the things I'm going to get to in a little bit, but there are more studies coming out showing that, of course, different probiotics have different effects on different physiological parameters, but it turns out that the soil-based ones tend to be more immune stimulating. So they tend to be good for situations where someone maybe has low immune function. They've been used in studies, for example, on the elderly, and we know that the elderly in general have decreased immune function, and they can help protect elderly individuals against infections or reduce their risk of infections in some cases. So again, they tend to, that's one of the features that we know about. They also tend to counteract some of the bad bacteria. So that's one of the main differences compared to some of the other like Lactobacilli and Bifidobacteria. And then there's also one that's not really used much, at least not in the US, that's been around for a long time. It's called E. coli Nissle, Nissle, and that tends to be even more immunostimulatory, stimulating the immune system than even the spore-based or bacillus bacteria. And so not a lot of research has been done on that one in terms of counteracting infections, but one I just came across recently showed that it really helps potentially counteract certain enteric infections like rotavirus. All right, so let me check again and just see if there's any other questions. All right, so I'm not seeing them on my laptop, but I am seeing them on the phone, although they're not showing up for very long, so I'll try to answer them as they go by. Let's see here. What are your thoughts on spore-forming probiotics? So that's actually, spore-forming probiotics are the same as the bacillus probiotics. So the bacillus group tend to form spores. So one of the main advantages that I didn't mention in terms of what I just talked about, so they tend to be immunostimulatory, but one of the main advantages is because they form spores, the thought is that they survive stomach acid quite a bit better, and that's certainly been demonstrated, so that more of them get into the digestive tract in a viable state. So they may have a bigger impact in certain ways than other probiotics that have a low viability. Another question is, do you still need probiotics if eating yogurt, kimchi, or sauerkraut? Good question. Ideally, I recommend, depending on the individual, potentially both if they can tolerate that, because fermented, depending on sort of what we're talking about, but generally fermented vegetables, fermented dairy have largely lactobacilli, but also, and especially dairy, has bifidobacteria, but then they generally don't contain as much of some of these other types that we're talking about. And one of the themes that I'm going to emphasize kind of throughout what we're talking about today is variety. So for the most part, I think variety is a really good thing. Not everyone is able to tolerate a variety in all these sort of different types of probiotics. Ideally, I think that a range is probably a good idea, and you can't necessarily get all the different strains and species from either just probiotics or just fermented vegetables and dairy, so it's a good idea to ideally, if you want variety, to get both. Okay, so let me go ahead and go through a few more things and I'll check back in on questions. So the last one I wanted to cover on probiotics is, I kind of touched on this already, but will probiotics work the same in everyone? So one of the common questions I get is frequently, what's your favorite probiotic? What's the best probiotic overall? That kind of thing. And there really isn't an answer for that because it's going to depend so much on the individual. Probiotics really, especially for those of you who've already been working a lot with probiotics, that it's very individual. So something that worked in one patient or client doesn't necessarily work well for the next one. And it really depends a lot on that specific probiotic and what's in it, as well as the specifics of that individual's microbiome, and then also their overall health. So that's one of the things I think is really starting to be recognized more and more when we're looking at what are the major factors that determine differences between individuals. So we know genetics is one, we know that their environmental exposures is another, particularly diet, and it turns out that the microbiome is sort of a third major determinant of these individual differences. And there's more and more studies coming out showing that both on the sort of root cause susceptibility end, that the microbiome has a big influence on what you're susceptible to and to what degree. But it also determines your response to a given therapeutic option, whether it's probiotics, whether it's diet, or whether it's other supplements. So it's something that we really need to take into account, although that's really an area where a lot more research needs to be done in terms of how do we individualize this in a better way. Okay, let me just check in on a couple more questions before I move on. What probiotic or what product would you recommend for the best results for getting a probiotic? I'm not sure. So that does kind of relate to what I just talked about in terms of what's sort of the best one out there. Certainly, I think the professional brands in general are going to be more reliable. There's a lot of information that's come out recently about for some of the over-the-counter type probiotics that oftentimes they don't contain what they say they contain, and that can, of course, can be a problem. So in general, the professional brands are going to be better. I use a range of brands, and I'm kind of always experimenting with them as well, and find that certain brands and certain ones work well with certain clients, and other ones work better with others. Claire has a really good range of probiotics, and there are other companies as well. Zymogen has a really good one. So there's a number of different companies that tend to have good probiotics in the professional category. Another one here is, do we need to supplement with prebiotics along with probiotics, or is eating prebiotic food sufficient? Good question. So some studies that have looked at that definitely show that when you add a prebiotic with a probiotic, and if they're put together, that's called a symbiotic, that can produce better results overall. They can increase viability, you can have better health outcomes. So the short answer is yes, in general, I think that's true. Probably that's also true, although I haven't really seen too many studies addressing prebiotic versus getting that same sort of effect or components from the diet. But just based on sort of everything I know about the microbiome and its relation to diet, I would say yeah, definitely that including certain factors in the diet. It's really going to depend though on the probiotic. So just a quick aside here is, for example, Lactobacilli versus Bifidobacteria. Bifidobacteria really do well on a very wide range of different types of fibers and fermentable carbs. And so if we're talking about oligosaccharides like fructooligosaccharides, inulin, pectin, resistant starch, Bifidobacteria can pretty much do well with all of those because they're very metabolically flexible, whereas Lactobacilli are much more restricted in what they can use for their fermentation process. So the specifics are going to be different depending on the particular species and the particular strain. So that's just kind of to address that question. All right, so let me move on a little bit to the gut microbiome. Just want to talk about a few misconceptions there. So we're kind of running out of time for this first part of what I wanted to talk about, so I'll just try to touch on a few there. So one of the misconceptions, which at first may not seem like a big deal, is you'll see or you'll hear in talks or in articles that the number of microbes in the microbiome is about tenfold more than the number of cells in the human body. And so that's relatively older information, and new studies show that it's actually more of a 1-to-1 ratio. I think some of those studies came out early last year, so the information's been out for a while. So does this really matter in terms of the exact ratio? So for the most part, I don't think it does. It's just sort of, they're updating the information. But I think it's also a little bit more symbolic, because one of the misconceptions that I hear and read about with the microbiome is that the microbiome, there's sort of this hype that the microbiome is so important, and because they outnumber us in terms of their cells, that they're basically sort of controlling us, and we're almost like these automatons that are being controlled by the bacteria. And in reality, the research suggests that it's certainly not that extreme, and that it's really a balance, that the microbiome affects our physiology, but then our physiology really affects the microbiome. And in particular, one of the sort of newly recognized major roles of the digestive tract is to manage the microbiome, and the immune system that's in the digestive tract as well. A large part of that is to manage the microbiome. So it's really a two-way interaction, and so I think that 1-to-1 ratio that's now the revised figure is really kind of nicely symbolic of that it's really kind of a symbiotic relationship where we influence each other. Let me see if there's a question here. All right, let me go ahead and move on. So the next misconception about the microbiome is this idea of kind of the black and white, good and bad microbes. So we think of Lactobacilli and Fado Bacteria, and then some of the commensals that are now being recognized as good, such as Clostridia, some of the species within the Clostridia group, as well as something called Akkermansia, which is also thought to be kind of a keystone beneficial species. So by and large, the words beneficial attached to those groups is pretty much on target, although in some cases, a few of them, like Akkermansia, have been associated with certain conditions. So they're not necessarily always beneficial. It really depends on the context. And it's particularly true for the ones that are considered harmful. Now we know there's really this whole range of microbes that there's certain ones on the extreme end that we know are sort of outright pathogens, and those are things like Salmonella, E. coli, pathogenic forms of E. coli, etc. Then there's a bunch of them that are sort of in between, and they're really only a problem under certain circumstances. So they may actually be beneficial normally, but then something changes, they either overgrow or they start to express virulence factors, and they can be a problem. So just keep in mind that this kind of idea of good and bad is something like almost everything in biology that we need to keep in mind that it's a little bit less black and white, a lot of gray area there. And as I mentioned, it depends on a lot of factors. So one of the things I wanted to kind of emphasize is that when people are looking at these microbiome tests or pathogen tests, and you see something that maybe sounds like it's potentially harmful, it really depends on the context, though, in a lot of cases, where in one individual, that particular microbe may actually not be contributing to anything pathogenic at all, whereas in another one, it may be. And again, a lot of that depends on their diet and their microbiome. And someone else's microbiome may be pretty resilient and be able to keep that harmful one in check. Others may not be able to keep that harmful one in check, and so then they're going to have those symptoms from that. All right, let's see here. Should we rotate our brands of probiotics? So I'll actually just jump back to that real quick. Yeah, definitely. I would say it's kind of a general approach that may not work well when we want to get a specific therapeutic effect with a particular strain. So we may want to stick with that particular strain. So there's really, I'll actually kind of cut to the chase here. I was going to cover this one later, but one of the overall strategies when it comes to probiotics as well as some of these other approaches is kind of a general approach for overall health versus achieving some very specific health outcome. So for the general approach, I would say the variety and rotating are a really good thing, potentially. And again, it's going to depend on the individual. You may need to rotate through a few different things before you find a set that really works for somebody. But when you're looking at trying to get a specific health outcome, there's more and more research on specific strains for specific health outcomes, or at least related to certain conditions. And so for those conditions, it really makes a difference potentially to work with specific strains where the research supports using that strain where they've established that there's a health outcome. So it really is kind of two different scenarios. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit more. The next point under just sort of misconceptions about the microbiome. One thing to add about, I mentioned that the good and bad is not really sort of a black and white situation. And a good example is recent research that has come out on hunter-gatherers and a particular group, I think it was the Hadza, where they had higher levels than expected of a potentially harmful or more pro-inflammatory group of bacteria, and that's a group called the Proteobacteria. And they normally associate Proteobacteria with dysbiosis and with inflammation. And so it's generally not considered good to have higher levels of Proteobacteria, higher than normal. They had higher than normal levels of Proteobacteria, but another thing to note is that these same hunter-gatherers are thought to consume a lot more fiber than we do in Western societies. And so they produce a lot more of what are called, their beneficial microbes produce a lot more of what are called short-chain fatty acids, particularly something called butyrate, which is produced by some of the beneficial bacteria. And that basically can counteract inflammation. So again, it really depends on the context. So in these, we don't know for sure, but the idea is that maybe in these hunter-gatherers that the fact that they have a lot more short-chain fatty acids produced, that basically they're able to better withstand some of these potentially pro-inflammatory bacteria. So really the context makes a lot of difference. Okay, so let me see what other questions we have here. What about probiotics and SIBO? Are probiotics contraindicated when someone has SIBO? That's a really good question and a pretty controversial area. And the answer that you get is going to depend a lot on the practitioner that you're asking. Some people say that they do have better results with probiotics. I think it also depends on the types of probiotics that they're using. So the ones that seem to be sort of more safe to use in a SIBO situation, where you're not necessarily risking exacerbating the situation more, would be some of those spore-forming or bacillus-type bacteria. And then also, there's one that's, I think, pretty commonly used now in that situation. It doesn't seem to generally produce side effects, would be something called Prescripticist. And that also contains a pretty wide range of, I think there's 29 different species in that product, including some of these soil-based or spore-based products as well. So generally, I think it's going to depend on the individual. Some people definitely, they do react, and other people actually it can benefit them. I think it's partly dependent, again, on their existing microbiome and sort of the state of their microbiome as well as the state of their mucosa. And we know some of the downsides of SIBO is that it can cause mucosal inflammation, and some of these probiotics may be able to help counteract that inflammation and help certain folks with SIBO and maybe exacerbate that situation in others. Okay, so let's see, I'll talk about one more misconception before I dive into some of the ways to balance the microbiome. So let's talk a little bit about dysbiosis, because that's a word that's used quite a bit now, I think, in a very general sense. So one of the questions is, what is dysbiosis? It's kind of used quite a bit by functional practitioners and nutritionists, but I think there's not necessarily a lot of understanding around exactly what is dysbiosis. So if you look at the research, researchers for the most part will say the same thing, that there's a lot more research that needs to be done to figure out what really constitutes a healthy microbiome versus an unhealthy microbiome. But that said, we really do know some of the basics now in terms of some of the common patterns. And I've done a lot of consulting on interpreting microbiome testing results, such as uBiome and other tests that are out there. And the most common patterns I see are reduced levels of some of these key beneficial bacteria, such as the Clostridia, such as Lactobacilli, such as Fado Bacteria, and Akkermansia as well, and then increased levels of some of these pro-inflammatory bacteria and other types of bacteria that may have some harmful effects. And again, oftentimes I'll see that as just a general overgrowth of Proteobacteria. That's a phylum that tends to be pro-inflammatory. But that's really kind of the most common pattern. And so yes, I would say we do know sort of the general features of some aspects of dysbiosis. But then also when you look at these different individuals and their patterns, there's a lot of differences as well. And so that's probably contributing to their different set range of symptoms and those kind of things. So yeah, so when you hear people say that we really don't know enough to really say what's good and what's bad, I think we're past that point now. I think we really do have some pretty broad ideas of dysbiosis. Certainly haven't identified all those details yet, but we do know quite a bit. All right, so let me jump to best ways to balance the microbiome, because I know that's an area that you definitely want to hear a lot more about. So I think I want to start off by talking a little bit about what are the best ways to balance the microbiome in terms of kind of the bigger picture, the perspective. You know, what does it mean to say we're balancing the microbiome? So kind of as I just mentioned, a lot of it has to do with this common dysbiosis pattern where someone has insufficient levels of some of these beneficial bacteria, and you need those to maintain a healthy barrier and to maintain a healthy mucosal immune system, and then an overgrowth of some of these harmful ones. So that's kind of the general pattern in terms of what we mean by balancing. Balancing also has to do with diversity. So you probably heard a lot about diversity in the microbiome, and that if you have reduced diversity, that can be associated with poor health outcomes. Someone who's less healthy, that's a pretty solid association for the most part. There's a lot of different health conditions that have been associated with lower diversity. The one thing to kind of note is there's really recent research that's just like everything, it's not always black and white, that there are some cases where increased diversity isn't necessarily a good thing. And the one that was identified in a recent study was for folks that have slow transit time or constipation, that process, because things are hanging around longer in the colon, allowing more time for a diverse range of metabolic products to be produced, some of which are potentially toxic. But that scenario with all these different products being produced from what's called protein fermentation can support more diversity. So that's why it's really important when you're working with microbiome testing to not only track diet before the test, but also to track transit time. That will help you interpret the test and determine whether this diversity metric that you may be seeing in a test is really real diversity or based on slow transit time. Okay, one other thing I want to mention about diversity is, so we tend to think of it as, a person with a diverse microbiome has more species and more strains overall than someone who has a less diverse microbiome, and that may be true. One other aspect of diversity, though, is sort of this another way we're talking about imbalance, where you actually do have a lot of these other species, but they may be at very low levels, and then you have a very small number of groups and species that are kind of dominating the microbiome. And so basically there's this imbalance with the dominant ones kind of keeping sort of these low abundance, diverse ones down. And ideally, it's thought that a healthier microbiome is less sort of imbalanced in that way, that you don't have quite so many dominant groups, that it's sort of more evenly distributed. So that term that's usually referred to more as evenness, and that's related to diversity. So that's one of the things that we tend to look for when we're doing microbiome analysis, is diversity, as well as getting a feel for the evenness as well. Okay, so that's a little bit about balance, and when we're talking about balancing the microbiome, gives you a little bit of a better picture there. Let me just check in on Questions? All right, so I don't see any new questions yet. Okay, so I think the common conception, this actually kind of falls more in a little bit of the misconception area that I just talked about. But when you talk to most practitioners about the microbiome, at least in terms of what I hear, there's a lot of interest in probiotics, there's a lot of interest in fiber, and so typically sort of I think the range of things that are mostly focused on right now to work with the microbiome is too narrow. Most people are thinking probiotics, most people are thinking fiber. And those are both important, but I think again we can sort of expand that range of therapeutic options. So I'll be talking about that in this part of the talk. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, let's see where I wanted to jump to next here. All right, so in terms of kind of how we approach balancing the microbiome, I tend to think of there's sort of two categories of factors that affect the microbiome. Kind of in a very close range, we have the mucosa. Of course, the microbiome is right there up against the mucosa, and there's lots and lots of interactions there. So mucosal health is really important when we're talking about sort of the internal factors, the physiological factors, and then sort of the wider picture in terms of body systems that the microbiome interacts with most. Obviously, there's the digestive tract, because that's where the microbiome is. There's the immune system, particularly the immune system in the digestive tract. The nervous system, and there's a big presence of nervous system in, of course, in the digestive tract as well as metabolism in general and endocrine functions. So those are sort of the four body systems that work sort of more or interact more closely with the microbiome and the mucosa. So it's important to sort of understand when you're looking at root causes those connections, and that will potentially help you decide what direction to go in. Then on the other side, we're looking at the external factors, the environmental factors. And the key ones really are diet, chemical exposures, and I'm talking about the sort of the broader range. That could be anything from environmental toxins and pollutants to even drugs and things like that. So just the wider picture of chemicals that can affect the microbiome. And then other microbes, that sort of idea of these external microbes that we're constantly being exposed to. Some of them are beneficial, such as the ones in probiotics and fermented foods, and then some of them are potentially harmful, of course, pathogens. So there's other factors as well, lifestyle factors, stress, and there's circadian rhythm, sleep, all of those have been shown to affect the microbiome, but the big three really are diet, microbes, and these chemicals when it comes to external factors. So again, kind of giving you the big context here. So in terms of diet, it's really, in terms of balancing, we're talking about really two things. We're talking about what do we remove and avoid, and what do we add and improve. So real quickly, in terms of things we want to kind of focus on in terms of removing or avoiding, number one would be processed foods. That's really for two reasons. Processed foods tend to lack, actually it's three reasons. They tend to lack fiber and phytonutrients, which are really important for healthy microbiome. They tend to have chemical additives, and some of those have actually been shown to have a detrimental effect on either the microbiome or the mucosa, or both, and that's things like emulsifiers and other additives. And then the other factor would be related to sort of partly to calories and also to just the overall eating pattern. So we know that overconsumption of food in general almost doesn't really matter quite as much the specific macronutrients, but just general overconsumption of food in terms of excess calories has been shown to have a detrimental effect on the microbiome, and particularly that its relationship with metabolism. So that's definitely a big factor in terms of the microbiome and sort of what we want to focus on. The other thing related to sort of the overall pattern of eating, in addition to just total calories, is sort of the pattern of when we eat. So the idea, of course, we've all heard of intermittent fasting and all different types of fasting that are out there now, fasting mimicking diets, etc. And I think that's great. I think that's an area that really needs a lot more focus and research on, because again, we're seeing that there's potentially a beneficial effect on the microbiome. This is based on, so far, very few studies, so it's not conclusive, but intermittent fasting does seem to have a beneficial effect on the microbiome in various ways. So again, when it comes to diet, we want to kind of balance calories versus not eating and sort of have that circadian rhythm in place. Let me just kind of jump here because I want to make sure I allow time for more questions at the end. So variability is something I really want to focus on. So when it comes to any of these factors that benefit the microbiome, we know that diversity is related to variety, I should say. Certainly dietary variety, in particular plant foods, is really important. That actually leads me to this little mnemonic that I use to help remember what are these key factors that help promote balance in the microbiome, and I call it the 4 Ps. So let's see if I can actually remember them now. There's only 4, so it should be easy to remember. So that's plant foods, so basically whole, organic plant foods and a variety of plant foods. That's prebiotics, phytonutrients or polyphenols, and then, of course, I'm forgetting the 4th one here. See if I have it written down. So it'll come to me as I'm kind of talking through that. But the idea here is that, again, when we're thinking through a therapeutic strategy, one of the things that's really a challenge now is so many people are on these restricted diets, elimination diets, partly because so many people are reacting to different foods, and that's in a lot of ways potentially counteractive to sort of broadening diversity and broadening the variety in the diet. So that's a real conundrum because we know we can't give somebody foods that they're reacting to. That can create an inflammatory situation and make the whole thing worse. But we also ultimately want to work towards getting their diet to be introduce more variety into the diet. So that's something I think in a lot of cases is going to have to be a longer term goal. We've got these immediate health issues to address so that we can eventually introduce a broader range of foods. So variety is really important in the diet. All right, let me just go through the next thing. I already talked about removing some of the bad things, overnutrition, benefits of pathogens. So pathogens is definitely one of the things that, of course you can't always avoid pathogens, but by maintaining a healthy microbiome and a resilient microbiome, we potentially can reduce even if we're exposed to pathogens, if our microbiome is healthier, there's something called colonization resistance that helps us resist pathogens. And so, again, that really relates to variety and balancing the microbiome and increasing diversity. And that has been shown to potentially reduce our risk factor for certain pathogens. All right, so one of the things I would add, though, to the 4 Ps, which I think is very important, are the fat-soluble vitamins. So particularly A and D, because those have so many functions in the intestinal mucosa. And we know there's this big influence that the intestinal mucosa has on sort of helping to balance the microbiome. And so deficiencies in either A or D or both, because they have such an important range of functions on the intestinal barrier, that can cause or contribute to dysbiosis potentially. So again, those are very important to make sure that we have in the diet. So overall, again, I want to just emphasize that the goal really is to try to balance sort of that discrepancy between the beneficial and the harmful ones, and you can often see that in a variety of microbiome and stool tests. And so that's one of the gauges that we can use to see sort of, how extensive is the dysbiosis and sort of those details about dysbiosis. And then there's a number of ways that, again, we can focus on trying to get those good guys up and suppress the bad guys. And it turns out that these 4 Ps really do focus on kind of balancing both ends of that equation. And I mentioned early on that phytonutrients are really turning out to be this important sort of missing thing that we hadn't focused on so much to help balance the microbiome. So just a little bit about that we know at one end of the spectrum we have antimicrobials, which are also generally phytonutrients, antimicrobial botanicals, and some of those are very strong, and so they can help counteract some of the harmful bacteria, but that they can also impact some of those beneficial ones, and we can end up with another sort of type of imbalanced microbiome if we overuse them. So just something to keep in mind, that we need to be careful and mindful when we're using antimicrobials, And in cases where we do need to use them, we need to focus on how do we build back up the microbiome afterwards to help optimize healthy balance. But then when you look at the big spectrum of phytonutrients, there's quite a bit of research on different types of phytonutrients that aren't necessarily strong antimicrobials, and that would be things like various types of berry extracts. Extracts from grapes have been studied, and those tend to be very balancing for the microbiome. Pomegranate, cocoa, different things from spices, so cloves and ginger and garlic and things like that, generally tend to be very balancing, again, unless they're used in excess or you're really focusing on just one or two. That actually leads me to kind of a side note here. You'll hear a number of people kind of talk about microbiome superfoods, and even some books are out sort of focusing on, what are the best foods to feed the microbiome. And to some extent, I think that's good because it's sort of highlighting foods that may be bringing more fiber, more phytonutrients into the diet. But again, we really want to keep in mind that one of the key goals is variety and balance. And if we're focusing so heavily on certain foods, that could actually create another imbalanced situation. So I'm not as big of a proponent of these so-called microbiome foods unless it's sort of incorporating them in moderation. All right, so that's kind of what I wanted to say about sort of balancing things through diet and the 4 Ps. Maybe I'll just go to my final tips here because we're almost at the end, and then I'll start diving into questions. So really the final tips that I wanted to focus on are, in the big picture, I mentioned these body systems that the microbiome is most connected with, and that it's really a two-way relationship. So when we talk about managing the microbiome or trying to balance the microbiome, it's not just these external factors. We're really also talking about these internal physiological factors whose normal job it is to help balance the microbiome. We basically want to help them do their job. So that's the digestive tract, and there's a lot of work we can potentially do there in terms of helping to balance the microbiome. Probably number 1 on that list would be making sure that we have good digestion. Because if things aren't properly digested, things get down into the lower digestive tract that normally wouldn't be there, at least not in sort of excess, and that's going to throw off the balance. And then probably motility or transit time would also be something I would say is very important. So those 2 factors, when you're talking about balancing the microbiome, again, it's not just probiotics, it's really looking at the digestive tract and making sure that whole process is running smoothly, as smoothly as possible. And then also looking at balancing the immune system. So inflammation tends to be a major driver of dysbiosis. And dysbiosis is a major driver of inflammation. It's sort of this vicious cycle, so you've got to really work on both of those. But again, keep in mind that there's these body systems that we have to take into account. It's not just diet, not just probiotics, etc. The other thing I wanted to really emphasize is balance and variety. And so variety, think of it both in terms of the content. So you want to get a variety of vegetables and fruits in the diet. You want to get a variety of prebiotics to kind of complement that, because diets are rarely perfect, and we may, even when we're trying really hard, we may be deficient in some of these other types of fibers. So it may make sense to sort of strategically supplement with certain types of prebiotics. And then also the same with probiotics and phytonutrients. So really want to make sure that we have a range of all of those in there, as long as the individual is tolerating them. And some people may be much more sensitive. So again, that's a very individual situation. And then the other idea when it comes to variety is rotation. So you really should rotate, ideally, through different types, so that you're not necessarily always getting exposed to the same thing. Again, when we keep kind of consuming the same foods over and over again, or using the same supplements over and over again, particularly when we're talking about prebiotics and phytonutrients, that potentially can contribute to an imbalance, because you're continuously feeding this same sort of bacteria that benefit from that and not feeding the other ones that don't benefit as much. And again, we don't want to have that sort of imbalance develop through our diet and supplementation patterns. So rotating is a good idea over time, and rotating different types I think is probably a good idea as well. consider the details, individual considerations. This is a big thing in the microbiome field. It's really, really difficult to come up with set protocols for a lot of this because individuals are going to vary so much in their reactions to probiotics and their response to probiotics, their reactions to dietary components, etc. So the idea is to start with these guidelines and have a range of options instead of a narrow range of options, and you don't really have a lot of flexibility. By understanding a wider range of options, and you have more to work with on an individual basis. So that's why I really advocate, this wide range of pretty much all these therapeutic options, especially the 4 Ps. So that's pretty much it that I wanted to talk about today. So let me go ahead and see if I can get some of the questions up on the laptop. If not, I'll answer the ones that are coming in on the iPhone. All right, so I'm still not seeing them on the laptop, so let me go ahead and see what's on the iPhone here. I'm only seeing just a couple at a time as they sort of float by, so I apologize in advance if I'm missing your question. So there's a question with MTHFR and histamine issues, what prebiotics can you use if fermented foods are an issue, such as excitotoxins? That's a good question. That's not something I've really looked into very much. I know that some probiotics, and I can't really tell you the details offhand, I'm just aware that some probiotics can provoke histamine type reactions, and some actually can help counteract that. I can probably follow up. I know that NTA is going to keep the video up for a while, and you should be able to continue to post questions. And these questions that are already posted there, I think will still be there. So I can answer some of these after this presentation or after this talk. But that's something I'd have to go back and look at my research to see in terms of the details. All right, so let's see, the next one. How will low stomach acid inhibit the benefit of probiotics? Yeah, that's actually a very interesting question, because on the surface you would think that low stomach acid would be beneficial, at least in terms of the probiotic viability, and allow more of them to get through in a viable state. So from that sort of narrow standpoint, it could be beneficial. But of course we know low stomach acid is sort of this key component of the whole digestive process, and when it's low, and some of these later processes then aren't triggered properly, and digestion overall is going to be compromised, including protein. In the bigger picture, that can create dysbiosis potentially and contribute to dysbiosis. And the probiotic then may not be as effective when we have this bigger picture of dysbiosis. So I think it really depends on sort of how severe the hypochlorhydria is. That does lead me though to one other point that I just want to make real quick is so with low stomach acid, one of the main consequences is going to be insufficient protein digestion. And protein digestion, when it's not optimal and more protein, undigested protein gets down into the colon, then the types of bacteria that tend to specialize in fermenting protein versus carbohydrates, they tend to increase in abundance and then produce more of these products, which some of these products are thought to be potentially toxic and contribute to some pathogenic processes. Some of them have been linked to, for example, autism. And so this whole idea, again, of making sure we have optimal digestion is really important, especially when it comes to protein, because we really don't, evidence so far suggests we don't want to have excessive protein fermentation, and that normally occurs in sort of the latter part of the colon. So the two things we can do in that case is, anything we can do to increase protein digestion and absorption and not have so much get into the colon. Also, it's been shown that fiber and phytonutrients can counteract protein fermentation. So at least if you have a situation like that and some of these tests can detect protein fermentation products, you want to make sure that you're working on both aspects of that, increasing the phytonutrients and fiber and working on digestion. All right, so the next question is, you might have already said it, so sorry if I missed it, but is it best to take probiotics with food or away from meals? I am sure it probably depends on what type of probiotics you are taking. So there is a little bit of research on that, and so far the 2 points that I would say when it comes to probiotics is that it's generally thought to be better to take it with food, particularly the ones that are acid sensitive. Maybe not quite as important with the bacillus or the spore-forming probiotics, this also known as the soil-based probiotics. But for Lactobacillus and Fado Bacteria, it turns out that when there's food in the stomach, there's usually some sort of buffering effect of the food on stomach acid, and so temporarily the pH can actually go up, so it's less acidic, and that can potentially help with viability. So that's sort of what the current research suggests. And then there was also one study I came across a while back that suggested that adding a certain amount of fat to the diet, making sure there's at least some fat with the meal, it's not a low-fat meal, that the fat itself somehow also helps increase the viability of probiotics. So I would say yes with meals and make sure there's some fat in the meal. Okay, so I'm currently studying to be an NTP. I'm recovering from severe adrenal fatigue from pregnancy, and I'm currently still struggling with insomnia. If you have any specific Apex energetics or biotics, let's see, I can't see the rest here, supplements to help with this. When it comes to the microbiome, that may be a question I have to kind of look into more. So offhand, I would say, I mean, since all these things are kind of interlinked, then certainly doing some work on helping to balance the microbiome can help that situation, especially it's often thought that adrenal fatigue in particular is sort of this downstream effect of gut issues. So to some extent, yes. Insomnia, again, it really depends. There is some potential connection kind of through that gut-brain axis between dysbiosis and some of these potentially harmful metabolites. Even histamine, for example, can potentially contribute to insomnia. So there's some potential connections, but we may need to follow up afterwards to talk about more detail. So I guess the short answer is no, I don't have specific products offhand that I would mention, other than just sort of the general principles I talked about to help balance the microbiome. All right, let's see if there's any other questions coming in. Also just going to check the laptop. Okay, so unless there's any other questions, I wanted to thank the Nutritional Therapy Association so much for providing this opportunity for me to share this information with you. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. And hopefully you found some of this information useful. If you have any additional questions, then feel free to post those in the comments area, and I'll do my best to answer the questions. All right, so thanks again, and have a great day. Alrighty, bye-bye.